So, guys, I want to talk about AEW, and I really feel like they have an issue with way too many special shows. And what do I mean by that? That last year in April, they had a Battle of the Belts, they had Super Card of Honor, and then they also had the Boston show where Mercedes Moné debuted. And, the past, few weeks until All In, they've had Fighter Fest in Denver. They had a 4 hour show in, I think it's called Summer Blockbuster in Portland, Oregon. And then they have AEW Grand Slam Mexico Arena. And then they also had AEW, 300 episodes and 100 Collision, really. So we have to talk about why special shows are needed and why there are a bad thing. That, special shows do boost ratings. Like WWE does it very good. They'll have some special shows once in a while. And the other thing that it does is that sometimes you have a long, stretch of time between pay-per-views. Like, for example, the last AEW pay-per-view is World's End, and then the next pay-per-view is usually AEW Revolution. So it makes sense between, in January, February, March, that you have another pay-per-view or a television special. And then sometimes you want to have yearly traditions, so yearly traditions are very, very important. But there are some, problems with doing too many special shows. That there is a diminishing return, really, because, if everything is special, why should I care about that? You had 4 special shows in a period of a month and a half, really. And mind you, you also have 2 pay-per-views in July, which is Super Card of Honor, and then also AEW All In. So, when you have way too many special shows, you're not going to get a lot more viewers. You're not going to boost the rating or anything like that, because it's going to be okay, they always do it. So, it's a diminishing return. And then the other thing that I want to talk about is long shows and overrun. This has been an issue with AEW. This is one of the things that I hate about AEW, is that I have one rule. 10 o'clock is 10 o'clock. It is disrespectful to have a show go over the time limit. And the reason why that's very disrespectful is because there's people like me who work at night. So if I'm reviewing AEW Dynamite and then it's I have to wait until 10:30 or 10:15, you're fucking up my time, really. And it's almost like, imagine if you went to a restaurant, you had a really great meal, and they're like, but let's stay for dessert, but we're trying out some new sample dishes for that we want to put on our menu, but can you stay so you can watch a video on the history of our restaurant, but can we do an interview with you for an online review for the restaurant? Eventually you're gonna say, get the camera out of my face, get all that stuff out of my face. I need to go. When I pay for the bill, that's when I leave. So holding people up is not respectful. And how it goes with special shows is 2 things. That, number one, 4 hours is way too much for professional wrestling. A 4-hour block is inappropriate. A 3-hour block is inappropriate. If you want to do a special show, 3 hours should be the maximum. For a professional wrestling show, every show should be 2 hours. 2 hours Collision, 2 hours Ring of Honor, 2 hours, Raw, SmackDown, NXT. 2 hours is appropriate because that's good watching. That's good duration. 3 hours is too much. 1 hour is too little. But if you expect me to watch a 4-hour show, that's way too much. Cleopatra, the Elizabeth Taylor movie was 4 hours. War and Peace was 6 hours. But 4 hours is a very long time. So, again, if you do back-to-back weeks of 4-hour shows, you're going to get diminishing return. I think what they said was that when they did AEW, one of their special shows, one of their 4-hour blocks, at the very end, they had less than 100,000 viewers, if I'm correct. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if you do too many special shows that are super long, people are not going to watch the whole thing because you're going to be why should I watch this? And then the other thing that I'm going to add is that, they didn't have 4-hour shows, which is they had 2 hours of Dynamite, 2 hours of Collision. And when Will Ospreay spoke on television saying, hey, you know what, we're going to continue this on Collision, it confused a lot of people like me. Like, you know, what the fuck? Is this a 4-hour show, or is this 2 hours of Dynamite and 2 hours of Collision? A 4-hour show means you give Dynamite extra 2 hours. So you say later on Dynamite, not, oh, well, it's 2 hours of Dynamite, 2 hours of Collision. No, that's not 4 hours of Dynamite, because that confuses the fuck out of the audience and everything like that, really. So, you know, the way that they market it's not good. And then the other thing, too, is that if you have pay-per-views, that's a bad thing. Because, you know, if you have a 4-hour Dynamite, and then another 4-hour Dynamite, and then you're doing Grand Slam and saying, hey, it's going to be 2.5 hours, and more than likely there's going to be an overrun, so it's going to feel like, you know, like 3 hours maybe. And then also, I believe they had AEW CMLL versus AEW CMLL versus ROH and AEW, so that's a pay-per-view. You know, that's another one. And then you have Supercard of Honor, which is another pay-per-view. You have your Collision, you have your 300 episode special. Thankfully, it's 4 hours, but you're showing the Collision on Saturday. You're not showing it back-to-back, really. And then also you have All In, really. So between All In, you know, you have, you know, at least up to 5 shows that are at least over 2 hours, and a few of them being 4 hours. So the problem is that, you know, like, how would people want to watch All In, really? Because that's supposed to be their WrestleMania. That's supposed to be like maybe a 6-hour, 7-hour, 8-hour show. Would I want to watch all that, you know, wrestling, really? Would I be excited for WrestleMania or SummerSlam or Slammiversary or Bound for Glory or the Tournament of Death in Combat Zone Wrestling or AEW All In or Double or Nothing, their biggest shows? Would I be excited for that if I'm watching, you know, weekly blocks of 4 hours or weekly blocks of special shows? Because how does your pay-per-view become special? How does it all become special if we're seeing long-ass shows, really? Or if you're putting all these really great matches on all these shows, you have to have a sense of, you know, not relying on really, really great matches. And that's kind of also been another issue with AEW, is that, and I'll talk about 2 other issues. And I think that the other big issue is that I don't see a continuing storyline in AEW. One of the big issues that they have with ticket sales and a lot of just, you know, their pay-per-view buys and viewership is that they don't utilize their time wisely. They don't have storylines. And what I mean by that is that they do have storylines. Like, honestly, the Adam Page storyline, if people want to help them out or not, okay, that's passable. Mercedes Moné and Tony Storm, that's a storyline. They are putting something towards that. And what I mean by that, and what I mean by no storylines, is that you have other divisions, you have other stories that you can tell that you don't tell. Like, for example, you have Adam Cole and Kyle Fletcher. You know, there's such a story that you can do there about Kyle Fletcher and Don Callis family harassing them. Last week, you could have had Kyle Fletcher bloody Adam Cole, and then Adam Cole's like, I want to do another open challenge. And he challenges Takeshita or somebody, and then he bloodies that person. And then it leads to, you know, like you said, like, and then it leads to maybe like a backstage fight between both groups, really. And then Tony Khan's like, hey, you know what? We're going to settle this. You know, it's going to be Kyle Fletcher versus Adam Cole, last man standing or something like that. You know, that you see, then you can use all these weeks that you have and all these special shows that you have to build a storyline between Kyle Fletcher and Adam Cole and talk about what their issues are and set up something. That's a story, you know, that's a simple storyline. Another storyline you can do, Marina Shafir versus Will Nightingale. You know, like how that's not continuing over the past few weeks is concerning, really. You know, Max Caster versus Anthony Bowens. That should be a match at All In. I even said Revolution, they should have had that. But the fact that, you know, you're not doing back-to-back weeks of them feuding, or or Anthony Bowens is losing, and then Max Caster does a rap about him and says something like, you know, you burned the match just like your house burned down, because he lives in the Los Angeles area, and other just hard-hitting stuff, really. You know, or says something like, you know, you are just like a gay wrestler. You never win in any company. You never win when you're on TV or something like that, because the stereotype because when professional wrestling was booked, a lot of bookers wouldn't push gay wrestlers and stuff like that. Like Max Caster was making raps about that. Could you imagine if he and Anthony Bowenstein led to a match at All In? Like I said about Billy Starks, the girl that's trying to gain her confidence. Really, what if he did a story about her wanting to have a match with, maybe against Megan Bain or another female wrestler? What about KJ? Since Harley Cameron's injured, what would happen if you had a women's tag team tournament, go through all the shows? You had it at Mexico Arena, and then you have Persephone and Thunder Rosa in that, and then they lose, and then Thunder Rosa's kind of like, what, I've been losing a lot, but I really just want, that victory, really. So she challenges Athena, and hopefully she'll walk and to final, but to Supercard Honor, and if she doesn't win that, she enters the tournament for the women's gauntlet, and then she wins that, and then she tries, getting the title off of Mercedes or something like that. So all these things are important, really, because we have all these special shows. Why not use that time to have a bunch of storylines continuing? And like I said, AEW, if you have a 12-match card, you got to have at least 6 or 7 storylines, and that's not that hard to do, really. And I also will say another issue is that the storylines that they have suck right now. Okada, Omega, Hangman, Moxley, and Tony Storm, and Mercedes, they're all passable. Okay, I'll give you that. But one of the bad storylines you're doing is Dax Harwood is FTR versus the Outrunners. The FTR can't talk to save their lives. They're very long-winded. Another bad storyline is Kyle Fletcher and Adam Cole, really, because Kyle Fletcher's been showing me week after week, really, that he fucks off too much. When people are chanting Kyle and whatever, he should have just said, okay, I'm a heel, I gotta behave like a heel. But imagine, as I said, you have storylines that suck, really. What would happen if you had a good storyteller or a story editor that says, hey, you know what, we're going to make a storyline that goes through all these shows, really. Or Kyle Fletcher, Adam Cole, really. You guys are just going to be you guys are going to be only on Collision the next couple of weeks because we need that show to pop, really. People love you, Adam Cole. So what we're going to do is that we're going to tell a storyline over the next couple of weeks, really. And we're going to make it good, we're going to make it compelling, and then after the show we're going to evaluate. So after the Kyle thing and him and Kyle O'Reilly and Kyle Fletcher, I'll be like, okay, you know what, you made it too funny, really. So we're going to film a backstage segment of Kyle Fletcher bloodying at Kyle O'Reilly, really, and we're going to put that on television, and it's going to set up a match, really. So things like that, really. I also, as I said, if you have storylines or use it to push other stories, you're going to have a better show, really. And I think the last thing that I'll say is ultimately, and then I'll also kind of say, last thing that I'll say about doing way too many special shows is that, they have diminishing returns. And one thing that I'm happy they got rid of was Battle of the Belts, really, because Battle of the Belts started to become predictable. The only time you really saw a title change at Battle of the Belts was if the title was vacated. I think the only time they changed the title was the ROH Trios title, where they had Dustin and the Von Erichs win it in Texas, But when you have special shows and you're putting all these really great matches on it, sometimes it's predictable. Championships are not going to change. They're not going to take risks. Because I know, the New Year's Fight for the Fallen show, if I'm correct, was Powerhouse Hobbs versus John Moxley. For the Boston show, it was Wardlow versus Samoa Joe. You always know when you have a heavyweight champion, they're going to retain during these special shows, really. And then the other thing, too, is wasting pay-per-view matches. I kind of said that, what would happen if you had Will Ospreay versus Swerve Strickland on AEW All In? What would happen if you had Ricochet versus Will Ospreay on AEW All In instead of the show that they had in October in Pittsburgh? What if you did something like Bryan Danielson versus Nigel McGuinness at All In, or you had Takeshita versus Will Ospreay Part 2, or like what they did last year in Arkansas. You had Will Ospreay versus MJF, and a few weeks later you were doing that at Wembley Stadium. So that's another bad issue, is that when you have too many special shows, it kind of motivates Tony Khan to say, hey, we're going to throw a pay-per-view level match. We're going to throw a couple of these pay-per-view level matches on our show instead of like building, or instead of being like, hey, you know what? Like I said, really, if you want to do something like Swerve and Ospreay, what if they said something like, hey, you know what? My source is like, my best friend is, Rob Van Dam, or my best friend is, is somebody else, really, is AR Fox, really. And then they had a match with, and then Ospreay has a match, and then Ospreay says, you know what, one of my friends is Kenny Omega, so you do like Ospreay and Swerve and Kenny Omega or somebody else, really. You get what I'm trying to say, really. There's ways that they can kind of set up things, or there's ways that they can kind of set up things, or like when you saw Kofi Kingston go after the WWE Championship, they didn't say, okay, well, Kofi Kingston has to beat Bryan Danielson, has to beat Bryan Danielson on SmackDown. No, they were like, okay, we're gonna give you gauntlet matches, and they say Bryan Danielson and Kofi Kingston for the show, really. You see what I'm trying to say, really. If you blow all these special matches and all these pay-per-view level matches, then why should I watch the pay-per-views if we're going to see on regular television? And then why should I watch the television matches as well? Because we all know that when you have something on television, you can't do the pay-per-view level quality stuff, really, because it has a different structure and flow, and then there's commercial breaks and all that stuff, really, So I really hope that AEW cuts down special shows. They have to understand that, like I said, they're almost like pornography. Like, they care more about the action instead of like the storytelling. You need the storytelling. So if you have more special shows and they're like 3 hours, use that as an opportunity to develop more storylines. What would happen if you had a special show in July after All In? Like 2 or 3 weeks after All In, or the start of August. Like Chicago Beach Break, and then you have Okada and Takeshita, get into a brawl, and then you do a storyline where you set up a match, or Mark Briscoe versus MJF. What if they got into a fight, they were talking, and they said, like, okay, one of the weeks that we have a special show is that we're going to actually have both you guys sit down in the ring, and we're going to talk over it, and everything like that, and that leads to a fight or whatever. So sometimes you can use special shows to build other storylines. You don't have to say, okay, well, Mark Briscoe and MJF looks like they want to feud with each other, and there's stories that MJF wants this feud. So what if they do MJF and Mark Briscoe, have 1 or 2 matches, and then you get to Forbidden Door, and then they have another match, and then it doesn't feel that special. Or you do Mystico versus MJF on the 300 show tomorrow, and then you do it again on AEW All In, really. That just wouldn't be good, really. So they have to be really careful with how they use special shows. I think cutting it down and then using it for, like, storytelling and storylines for over a couple of weeks, that would be the best option.